This is the Self-Taught or Not podcast with
Dylan Israel
and Eric Hanchett, where we teach you the do's and don'ts of software development from two software development professionals, one self-taught and one not.
All right, so we are back at it once again, and although we said that we weren't going to talk about really technical subjects on this, I think we're doing an exception because Eric and I, for those of you who don't know, currently both work in Angular, and he thought that it'd be a great idea to do such a podcast.
Yeah, and I think we can open it up a little bit. I like the more soft topics, but I think just talking about programming languages in general, not getting too specific, not too technical, I think is the sweet spot in our podcast. And I think the Angular is great because one thing I like about Angular is that it has all these really cool things built into it, which if you come from Vue or React, you kind of have to pull all these different libraries in, while on the other hand, React has it, or excuse me, not React, but Angular has it all built in.
Yeah, and that's sort of one of my people. I get asked the same questions weekly, as I'm sure you do. Is like, what's better to learn, React or Angular? What do you like more? What do you work in? And I think we have to sort of get away from what you like more and what's best for the scenario. And to do that, you have to really understand is what you're trying to accomplish. But I do like Angular more because I like going to the sort of one-stop shop where I know that, hey, if I am going to use an additional dependency, it's maintained by a similar team.
Yeah, it's going to look really similar between all the different Angular apps. You're always going to have these different components. You're going to be using services, directives. It's really similar. So let's jump into a few misconceptions. By the way, my voice is a little gruff today. Hoping I'm not coming down with a cold, but hope you guys understand.
Just working too hard on that open source project.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm working. If you don't know, I'm working on an open source project called Dev Bootcamp. So that's a quick plug for that. I'll put a link in the show notes. Cool. So there's some definitely misconceptions I hear about Angular. And I don't know if you've heard these, Dylan, but I just was at a conference the other day and we were just kind of talking about different JavaScript frameworks. And once I brought up Angular, they either get confused, they don't understand the differences between the old version of Angular, which is now called Angular.js, versus the new version, which is Angular, just Angular by itself. That's what we call it, which is usually Angular. Sometimes you might call it Angular 2+. So they don't understand the differences between the two. But other things I hear is like it's too complicated, like the payload side's too big, it's too confusing for beginners. Have you heard these?
Yeah, I have. And in terms of it being too complicated or too confusing for beginners, one of the things I say to developers, and they say, should I learn React or Angular? I typically will say, go learn React because that's where like a lot of jobs currently are. That's why they're teaching in boot camps and it's growing very rapidly. But one thing I will tell people is that I think Angular, in terms of, will introduce you to a lot of more advanced concepts and make you a better developer, like just because of the implementation of TypeScript. But in terms of payload size, I think it sort of depends on how you build your application. You can do things like lazy loading. Just in Angular 8, they, for instance, just by doing the update, lowered your bundle size by 7 to 20%. And so they're always working on these things. They're building new pipelines. So I think a lot of times it's just people like React. Like, and we've talked in the past where React is the best. It's like, okay, I think it's okay. Like,
it's the best ever. Yeah, I mean, that's good. I have no friends that love Vue. I'm a big fan of Vue. I think it's really awesome, and we have very passionate React developers and Vue developers. But I think Angular definitely is falling in a lot of confusion. There was also a survey. There's the State of JavaScript survey that they put on every year, and they interview thousands of people. This organization puts on, and last year they had the popular different frameworks, and a lot of people put Angular, but they didn't specify the difference between Angular.js and Angular. So Angular started getting really bad reviews. Like people were saying, "Oh, I don't want to use Angular anymore," but really it was because they didn't differentiate between the two. So it's kind of it's really accelerated the misconceptions behind Angular, I think. But today we are clearing those conceptions up. Obviously, it's not Angular is easy. It's easy. It's actually really easy to get started. It has really great tooling. and it kind of generates everything for you. It uses classes. So if you come from a Java or C# or backend background, you're going to be right at home with Angular. And even if you don't come from the backend, you just need to learn some basics of classes and object-oriented programming, and that'll help you a lot.
Yeah, and I mean that's part of the reason that TypeScript's implemented in it, which is I'm a huge fan of. Like, more than liking Angular, I just like TypeScript. I think it's one of the best items to come in the last few years, and really you're even seeing nowadays, like it got shipped with Angular, but you're seeing more and more now that Vue projects and React projects are picking it up as well.
Exactly. And TypeScript's great. And one thing I know with classes, there is definitely a divide between the developer community. Some people love the JavaScript developer community, that is. Some people really like the new inclusion of ES6 classes that came out a few years ago. Some people are still a little hesitant on it. I know React, you can create your whole app using classes. And then I know recently they switched over to hooks, but classes are still really important. People use them everywhere.
Yeah, I feel like people complaining about the sort of the sugar syntax that came with classes is, you have to understand, looking at like prototypes and actually seeing like I'm currently teaching my girlfriend how to code as she goes through the you know what made sense? The classes. You know what didn't make sense? Teaching her prototypical inheritance. Like, so like in terms of things being too confusing, it's one of those items where I feel like if you're just holding out because you don't like the new, cleaner syntax that is relatable to almost every type of developer, that you're just sort of complaining. That's really it.
Exactly. And I've seen the same thing too. Yeah. The prototypical inheritance stuff can be a little confusing at first. And I like objects. Like, here's an object. You said syntactic. I guess essentially it's syntactic sugar over the prototypical inheritance.
Yeah, basically. It does 99.9% the same stuff.
Right. And syntactic sugar is just a way to say that it's putting...
It's the syntax. The syntax got updated that delivers the same functionality and just a cleaner version. At least in my opinion. That was the intent, I should say.
So let's jump into the history of Angular. So it launched in September of 2016. It's only about 3 years old, really. If you want to go back to Angular.js, so there was a big confusion when Angular.js moved over to Angular. So if Angular.js had like this had directives and it had this different way of operating with its lifecycle, and basically Google couldn't, I don't want to speak on behalf of Google, but from my knowledge, it wasn't easy for them to convert Angular.js over to what they wanted. So they just rewrote the whole thing and created Angular, which was first called Angular 2 Plus, but just Angular. And so Angular.js came out in 2010, but Angular came out in September of 2016.
Yeah, and God knows the beta and alpha was out for like 2 years. So it's
yeah, so even further if you were using it earlier than that. So if you ever see a job app asking for 10 plus years of Angular experience, then be wary of that.
Yeah, any job app that asks for 10 plus years of any framework experience, be wary of whoever wrote that job app, because it's not.
The version history, when it came from Angular 2 to Angular 4. I don't think I even heard anything about Angular 3. And then it went 5, 6, 7, 8, and they're pretty good. I almost say like this 6 to 8 month release cycle. Angular 7, Angular 8 just recently came out. Angular 7 was, I don't know, like 7 or 8 months ago. And they have long-term support though. So all the major releases are supported for 18 months. And they have 6 months of active support. And then they have 12 months of long-term support.
Yeah, which sort of, most major frameworks you're going to be working in today are going to have similar support plans. And part of the reason that you go and use a framework, that's sort of, one of the big three, if we want to say that. But to the sort of just interesting fact about like, we went from 2 to 4, what the hell happened to 3? If I remember correctly, so Angular follows sort of they want all their major versions to release in sync, and apparently the router, if I remember correctly, they broke, they made again, then they broke again, and then they're like, just jump to 4 and everything because it's not gonna work. So I think that's what happened to Angular 3, if I remember correctly.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah, I'm sure So Angular is almost like a package with a bunch of packages underneath it.
Yeah.
But it's all bundled together in using their tooling called Angular CLI. So let's get into that. So there's a lot of different tooling. So we're going to kind of touch on what these are. We're not going to get into too much detail, but we'll just kind of go back and forth here. So maybe I'll start. Angular CLI is the tooling that you're going to use to create your Angular app. So unlike React or Vue, you can't just plug in a CDN script into an index.html file and all of a sudden you have Angular. It doesn't work that way. Really, you need to have this tool to build your Angular apps because it's going to install all the dependencies and everything that you need. It's actually was built upon the Ember CLI. So Ember CLI was kind of the forefront of creating these client tooling to help create these single-page application apps. And by the way, if you don't know, I guess I missed this part. Angular is one of the top 3 frameworks where you create single-page applications, or SPAs as they're known, to create your web apps. But anyways, Angular CLI is the tooling that helps create it. It has generators in there, so you can generate your services. You can generate your directives and everything you need. And I'll explain what those are in a moment.
Yeah, and probably the main reason that you're going to use CLI. And so I have a tech lead that we have both guested on his podcast that I've worked with, and he's the one who introduced me to Angular, but he will complain again and again, like, how would you create an Angular project from scratch? How long, how much time does that take? And apparently it takes about a week, because that CLI is doing a lot of stuff for you. It's compiling, it's setting up, when you create a new project, it's setting it up so that you can compile down to JavaScript, your TypeScript. It's setting up so that you have testing built in, that your SAS files are compiling down to CSS. So, it's getting you all that Webpack config, that Karma config, all those configurations so that you can make a very robust application, as well as doing your bundle sizing and everything so that it's the payload size is down. So CLI, you can use it to, create a lot of these items, but the sort of main thing in my eyes anyhow is just getting that initial sort of Bootstrap, that very powerful Bootstrap project together.
And when you build it, you're basically just creating CSS and HTML files. That's at the end of the day what we're creating. That can just be thrown up anywhere. And having all that tooling to do that for us makes our lives much easier. Because there's so many cool things like TypeScript, like Dylan just said, that makes things much easier.
Yeah, and if you've ever been stuck on a Webpack issue, and you eventually will, I couldn't even imagine setting that up and doing all this sort of stuff without jumping out my second story. Like, it is getting stuck on a stupid JSON config is probably one of the most frustrating things in the world.
Yeah, not fun at all. Angular console is somewhat new. It's more of like a UI version of Angular. So if you don't want to use Angular CLI, you can use Angular console to generate your apps. Angular Universal. I think you have a lot of experience in Angular Universal. Dylan, what is that?
Yeah, so it's actually what I've been building my site Video Dev Docs off of, which is a video documentation platform. And so traditionally speaking, when you are building a client-side application or a single-page application, it's going to generate that on the front end, which is fine unless you're worried about SEO or you need to maybe make it faster. And so part of the reason that you'll have server-side rendered Angular using Universal or Nuxt if we're doing Vue, and then I don't know what they do it in React, but I imagine there's something in React. Next. Yeah, so is that one, the search engines can now crawl your site because it's delivering it already pre-compiled from the server. And so there's the SEO benefit as well as the benefit of speed as well, because now your server's rendering it, but does sort of the con to that is your server is now compiling it, which means that your costs on maintaining your server go up. But yeah, so Angular Universal is pretty sweet. There's some wonky stuff that happens with it, but it's been adopted by the sort of Angular team and updated. And you can't use things like the document because the document doesn't exist because it's on a server. And so it's stuff like that where you have to start thinking a little bit differently. But that's really Angular Universal.
I haven't used it, but it sounds pretty awesome. There's a few other tooling, Augury, which is like a development tool plugin. Do you use that, Dylan?
So, so I used to. My current workplace does not allow me to install Chrome extensions, and so we have lockdown browsers because apparently in a lot of those free to use tools, there's like, well, if you work for an enterprise client, we're going to charge you, sort of thing. And so I've submitted a Chrome extension request 4 months ago. I don't think it's getting approved. But yeah, I used to use it. It's a nice little tool, and a lot of frameworks nowadays will have development tools that are Chrome extensions that you can use to see where your code goes. So because not only it's sometimes it gets very hard to see the rendered out HTML and see what does this relate to my code. That's really what it's there for.
Yeah, that's very cool. I don't use it too often. I'm usually jumping in and just looking at either putting console log statements, or you can, if you turn source maps on when you do your development work, you can just put breakpoints inside the browser to do your debugging. But it just depends on what you're trying to do. NX Narwhal. I'm actually using this. I can speak to this. We're using this at my company, and the Narwhal is like an extension. It's an open source extension that you can use to help create monorepos. So we have 4 or 5 of our Angular apps all in this monorepo, and it has this shared library, so we can just pull in different libraries to the different apps really easily. It's really cool. You can also do a lot of neat things with testing. You can do a lot of different graphs. It works really well with Angular Console. So we're playing around with that. We have all our apps in it right now, and it's definitely neat. So the testing tools, they've changed a little bit in the last few years, but essentially for your end-to-end testing, there's Protractor, although you can install things like Cypress if you want to change your end-to-end test framework. Jasmine is also kind of out of the box, comes with the Angular tools, and then Jest, I think you can choose now Jest with Angular 8 and 7. I think that's new.
Yeah, and so the transition should be easy enough. Now, when I created it, I don't think I created an Angular 8 application like 6-8 weeks ago when I started Video Dev Docs. I don't think they actually ask you if you want to use what testing framework you want to use, but you do it one time, I forget. But I do plan on switching to Jest from Jasmine, because there's some speed efficiency when it comes to your tests as your project grows, and sort of breaks it down a little bit cleaner in terms of the test coverage. Although I haven't dove into Cypress yet, but someone told me, I did read a blog on Cypress, that at some point the Angular team's going to make a move to that. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I saw in the blog. And from what I've seen about Cypress, it looks to be easier to work with than Protractor.
Yeah, I've been using Cypress in our projects. It's pretty awesome. It's really easy to has like a graphic interface, and you can see exactly how the tests are running, and you can even easily just use these selectors to do what you want and press buttons. We still kind of rely at our company with our QA testers. They have a big automation suite, and they use these QA test tools where they can do end-to-end testing a little bit better than what we're doing. So we kind of almost rely on them and write all our own tests. If you're looking for a store, there's NGRX. This is like a Flux type store pattern that you can install, and it's dependency you can install in your Angular app. There's also, you can even use Redux itself, just straight out of Facebook's Redux if you want. And then, of course, we mentioned before, there's TypeScript support built in. Do you use NGRX at all?
So I try to stay away from state management. So this is the reason why, as I consider it by and large an anti-pattern. Most of the time, from what I've seen with organizations implementing some sort of store or state management, it's because they have poorly architected their project, and it's very hard for things to be in the state that they need to be. And what's like the example I give to why I think it's a poor thing and why I try to avoid it is, like, rule number 1 of web development is to not have fucking globals. And it's essentially a global that's hard to modify and that has accessors and all this sort of stuff. And so I try to avoid it, but I have used it. But I always try to shut it down if it's up to me, because I think what happens is it slowly gets corrupted again and again, and it sort of becomes this anti-pattern.
It definitely can be, and it's definitely not for every project. We have an app that's now approaching 100 different components, and we are using NGRX, and it is a beast, but it's so much nicer to like import that NGRX store into one of our components that we needed. We can do fetches, or we can do dispatches and set information. So, mileage may vary, but let's move on. Lazy loading is something that you can do, which is part of the router. So you can have different routes load when they're hit instead of right when the app loads. That can be really cool. We do prefetching in our app, so when you hit the first route, it loads that route first, and then in the background it loads all the other routes. That way, what we found, and when we had lazy loading every single component, we would have a slight delay every time they click continue, and it was sort of noticeable because it would be downloading the JavaScript for each route every time they click next. So instead, we decided to do this prefetching, so the first page pops up pretty quickly, and then if they sit on that page for like more than 10, 20 seconds, all the other ones download in the background, but it's not waiting for the whole app to download.
Yeah, I just implemented this in my application as well. And so I think lazy loading, we've been talking a little bit about, we've been mainly talking about Angular, but we haven't really talked too much about single page applications, which Angular is. And one of there's several major benefits to using a single page application, and lazy loading is one of those, and routing is one of those. And so, you have to sort of define a lot of times your strategies with these things of how you want them to work. And lazy loading is probably one of the best things that have been added to not just single page applications in general.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't matter if you're in React or Vue. Eventually, your bundle size is going to get pretty big. Like it's going to be at the point where people on mobile are going to have to wait like 10 seconds to download it. So anything you can do to help those, I think it's mostly the mobile users that get shafted when you're using a client-side framework and you start, your bundle size starts getting bigger. So yeah, anything you can do to help those people out, because you literally have to have your bundle size down to like 200K to 500K for it to load any quickly if you're on a mobile. That's really hard to do. So if you can do like server-side rendering or breaking up to lazy loaded modules, that really helps. In fact, in our app, we still don't have sub-optimum mobile. We're still a little slow. We're still trying to figure out how to even get it even faster. But now, since our app's getting so bigger, we're trying to figure that out. And it's always like a game you play of like, okay, do I need this library? There's tools that you can run that just analyze your bundle and then tell you the size of everything inside of it. Then you can figure out like what's too big. And usually Angular is pretty good. It does code splitting and tree shaking and things like that, where it sees if you're not using a certain module or library that it doesn't include it inside the bundle. So usually it's pretty good at that, but eventually you're going to have problems.
Have you ever worked on a project? So I did some research a while back when we were trying to do efficiency gains on our app, and I came across this concept that a lot of people set sort of bundle limits in like hard-coded in the sense of like the pipeline literally will not accept the PR and build and won't be merged in if your bundle size goes above this amount. And sort of, have you ever worked on anything like that?
No, but I noticed when I was building my Angular 8 app, we just upgraded it. It started saying in my warnings that if it's over 2 megs, it's like your bundle size is over 2 megs, warning. So I wonder if there's something you can build into your build pipeline that warns you about that too.
Yeah, and so that's sort of what I'm talking about. But then your build pipeline will reject it, and so you sort of set these limits on what's there, similar to how you would have like not let your code coverage degrade. Like, say you were at 80% code coverage, you're like, if it goes down below 75%, don't accept it, right? And doing that, except now with sizing as well.
Interesting. We'll have to look into that.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where like you have to work at a very professional place where the business understands the cost of the speed gains or the cost to maintain the speed, because if not, they're just going to tell you, I don't give a shit, increase the megabytes.
Yeah, you have to be a kind of a sophisticated organization to even start looking at that stuff. And yeah, some don't even care. That's funny. The one thing I noticed too that with Angular 8 is that you can set, so if you are going to support those older browsers like IE11 or older, you can set up differential loading, which will create different bundles for different browsers. So it'll detect if you're on IE11 and send a different bundle down than if you're on like the latest version of Chrome. And that helps with your bundle size too.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on. We do have internationalization and Angular material. But let's just jump into the elements of the Angular app. So here are kind of the building blocks of an Angular app. So if you jump into development, you're going to expect these. I think in all the different major frameworks, components are going to be the building blocks of every app. Inside Angular, there are classes that are there, and then you set up inside your class, you set up which location you want to have your style sheet, which location you have your HTML, and which location you're going to have your your HTML and your CSS file. But you don't specify your spec file, I don't think.
Yeah, no. So your spec file is going to be picked up through your config files. And then what we're talking about is called a decorator, which is something I'm hoping is added. I really like the concept of decorators where, to give you an idea, essentially a decorator is something that you throw into a file that collects metadata about your application. In this case, it's either going to be your template location or the selector name that's going to be associated with it or the styles. And there's a bunch of other things where it's sort of almost just like a JSON collector of where these things are located and what they're going to do. And so I really like decorators, and I think they're working on something to be part of the ECMAScript standard, but you know how slow that stuff goes. It's going to be like a decade before they come out.
Yeah, I know you have to, in Babel, which is a way it's a plugin project that you can use to convert your code into JavaScript. So if you're using some of these newer features that aren't available in JavaScript, I think there's an experimental flag for decorators that you turn on so that it recognizes it. So yeah, it's deeply integrated into TypeScript, and you can put these decorators above classes and certain things, and it does things for you. Like it kind of adds more functionality for you. So you can put in a decorator inside your Angular apps, and essentially, I've heard some criticism. You do have to I think you can combine it all in one file, but most of the time you do have at least 3 files: your TypeScript file, your CSS file, and your HTML file.
For components, yeah. So I like that. This is one of those things where it's a difference of opinion. And so, Angular typically will break out all of its dependencies. Your template will be one place, controller one place, and your test one place, styles one place. I like it that way. But I definitely understand the sort of sentiment that, in Vue, for instance, you're going to have things piece by piece in your file, because in that standpoint, and I say this as someone who's done a limited amount of Vue, the idea is that we have a separation of concerns, but they are not separate.
Yeah. So in Vue, you have a single file component, and then you have a template at the top with basically your HTML, and then you have your kind of your logic in the middle in a script tag, and in the bottom you have your styles. That's the essence of single file component. And then you go to the far extreme, which is React, which you're mixing and matching your HTML and your JavaScript in your JSX in one file. And then with styled components, you can put those in a different file, but a lot of times you just have everything in one file. It's all mixed together. So yeah, that's the opposite end of the extreme. So let's move on. So you do have modules. That's one thing that can be annoying when you first start working with Angular, is every time you create a new component or class, you have to import that class into what's called a module file that tracks everything and all your dependencies and all your classes inside your app.
Yeah, in fairness, modules, if you've ever worked in Angular, it's very easy to see that modules were kind of an afterthought. And so it's one of the more funkier things in Angular that, in my opinion, wasn't the most well developed, but they are very important. Part of the ways that we're able to lazy load, and how, we talked earlier about how important that is because we have these modules that say these dependencies go here, and this is what's required to load this page. So we won't load what's on all these other pages, but definitely a little bit wonky when you're getting going.
And you can, when you first start learning, you can just have one module, the app module, and that's it, and just throw everything in that sucker. But when your app gets a little bit bigger, you might have modules that import into other modules, that import into other modules, and then it can get a little confusing. But we won't get into that today. There's something called directives, which there's a lot of built-in directives inside of Angular. You might see ng ifs, there's like if statements, ng fors, ng switches. You can do a lot of binding anywhere inside your HTML. You can bind stuff from your TypeScript file into it. Like you can use ng class. You can do two-way data binding and one-way data binding too. So ng model provides a two-way data binding, parsing, and validation for form controls, for example.
Yeah, and so directives, so there's sort of two types of directives. There's the structural directives that Eric went over, like ngIf, ng-for, ng-switch, where it's actually going to either change the structure of your document, and then there's directives where you're maybe modifying something. And so directives are one of those items where you're not going to create too many custom directives most of the time. I made one last week where it was essentially a debounce directive. So if you click this element, it debounces the click, items like that. And sort of the go-to directive when you're learning is like, oh, change the color of this element by just putting a directive on it and all this sort of stuff. But I don't know, maybe you have a different opinion on directives. I've found directives, like the built-in ones you're going to use daily, but like creating custom directives, I feel like I do once every 6 months.
Yep. Yeah. So me too. I don't use many custom directives. You certainly could if you found situations. When you create a custom directive, you can then add it directly into the HTML. So we did a feature flag one where we have a feature flag directive that we can just slap on any HTML element, and then it'll either appear or disappear depending on these flags are turned on or off and what we pass into it. So that's one thing you can do. Pipe operators are ways. How would you describe pipe operators, Dylan?
Pipe operators are all about presentation. So you're going to use a pipe in your components, typically where, say we have some data, we're going to pass in an array, but what we want to see is maybe that array concatenated with something, or maybe we want to have that array filtered. Pipe operators are really there to have data that's going to go on the screen, but is not there in the form that you want it. And there's other ways that you can go about doing that by using functions that then modify that data, have a presentation. But pipe operators, and a good example of that is the currency pipe, which is something that you're going to, it's going to come natively where, hey, I have this number of 80.80. and I want it to be displayed as whatever currency that the user is in. And, there's a number pipe where maybe you're going to control what the decimals look like and items like that. But it's really about taking that data and displaying it in whatever form or fashion that you want.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically what I use it for, mostly just presentation. I think the most common one is dates and currency. We use a third-party plugin too. I'm trying to remember the name of it. That does a ton of different gives you more additional pipes. So instead of just being able to do the built-in ones like currency and dollars, that you can, it's called NGX mask. So it adds a bunch of really cool ones that you can do that is beyond the normal ones. Like I did it, like adding a $sign to an input and then auto formatting it in certain ways. It was really helpful for me.
Yeah, I think pipes are one of those items that are underutilized by a lot of Angular developers because they find other ways to do similar things that are oftentimes less efficient. And so I think pipes are one of those items that maybe Angular devs need to just look at again, because back to that decorators, you have things where that you can in your pipe set it so that it only runs once or it only does this, and there's items that will make it much more efficient than having a function return your data, for instance.
Yep. And so inside Angular, you can set different bindings, different directives that will trigger when things change. So you can put an input, like a change. Every time a change event happens on an element, it can then trigger something inside your TypeScript file. If you're noticing you're doing that a lot and you're doing different, just changing the values or changing things, you may want to start looking at pipes, and might be a more efficient way to do things. One thing we're not going to get too big into, but RxJS is built into Angular. If you ever have to deal with the forms, which we'll talk about in the future, or NGRX, or even if you're doing HTTP requests, you're going to be dealing with RxJS. And it's a way of thinking of your data as streams instead of like promises. So these streams of data can then be piped to different areas. You can add debounces. We mentioned that earlier. You can add in retries. You can add in a take one, so it only runs once, or you can have it run twice. And then you can subscribe to different RxJS functions and then do things with it. I think you can get away with not doing a ton of RxJS. You can convert your RxJS, like the built-in HTTP library into Angular is by definition observable, but you can convert it into a promise if that's the way you like it. And I know that, Dylan, you like to do that sometimes.
Yeah, so RxJS is very powerful, and I'm a big fan of it. But I also think for most applications that it's overkill. So like a lot of in my current project, all I'm doing is taking the route that's there and taking the params and doing a single API call. And instead of going through all the sort of black magic that RxJS does and having to subscribe and then having to unsubscribe and all this additional stuff, because it does a lot of powerful things, but if you don't need those powerful things, promises in my case is what I like to go with. But I do use RxJS daily because of everything that it does. It really makes a lot of it makes it a lot less error prone from the user because of how powerful it is, and a lot of those features where you're like, oh, I double clicked it. Well, that's fine because we have a debounce on there and we're controlling our data stream. I want to not fire off a new API call because it's the same value as the previous value. There's a lot of stuff that RxJS can do, but I typically like to stay away from it if it's not needed.
So do you think beginners should learn RxJS if they're learning Angular?
So yes and no. I think you should take the time to understand what an observable is, and then as you go and sort of figure out like how you're gonna utilize it, that may come later, right? I think you need to understand the fundamentals of it about having your data stream, because one very powerful aspect of using things like observables is now we can update our data when the server says something's changed. And it can, typically when we're using promises, the way that you think about data flowing, this goes back to the whole stream, is that I get the data from the server, it comes back. But when you're using RxJS, it changes that whole dynamic where you go get the data, it comes back, but we're still connected. So if the data updates on the server, your SPA is going to update. And you have to be aware of that, and there's sort of some counterbalance. So I think it adds complexity. So I would say first sort of get comfortable with Angular, and then maybe use the fundamentals of RxJS before you start diving deep, because sometimes people go way too deep in RxJS, and they've just been hacking things together before they actually really understand how it works.
Have you ever had to cancel anything? I know one thing RxJS does better than promises is you can actually cancel things. You can't cancel a promise.
Yeah, no, I haven't had the opportunity to do that.
But there's definitely some situations where you can use RxJS.
It's not a one-to-one thing. It's not like, oh, you can use one in exchange for the other. Promises is more simplistic, but also has many less features than RxJS with the streams. But with that comes complexity. So you just, I like to raise the point about it because I feel like a lot of times developers just do what they think other developers are doing instead of, which is fine most of the time, but instead of thinking about what's best for their use case.
I think the next topic you know pretty well, dependency injection. There's something called that at injectable decorator and services. So services, well, go ahead and explain what services are.
Yeah, so services for a lot of JavaScript developers, if you're a C# dev or a Java dev, it's all going to make sense. But for JavaScript developers, you can think of services as almost like utility functions that you're passing in as a dependency. And as you go and build, let's say, for instance, we have a service that's calling a quote API. We're going to get a quote. One of our dependencies that you might have is the HTTP client where we're passing that in. So when we use the quote API, we're going to create an HTTP that's going to go and fetch the data that we're going to use. And so it's really about utilizing the concept of dependency injection, which traditionally, if you were just doing like regular JavaScript, you wouldn't necessarily do it this way. You'd probably just have some sort of util file that you import and do it that way. But it's very similar in that fashion.
Yeah, and the way I think of services is they're more like a way to share information between multiple components, because you can actually do it both ways. But the traditional, probably idiomatic way of using services inside Angular is that it has one instance, and that instance is almost like a singleton, and it can be shared between multiple components. And you can have that data be available like a utility, like you said, but it would have that information kind of between all of them. You can even set information in there and share it, which is helpful.
Yeah, and it goes back to the whole topic of RxJS, where a lot of times when you want to treat your service as a singleton, you'll have a behavior subject or a subject, some of these data stream topics that you may not be familiar with, so that maybe we're all listening to the same stream, and then when that stream sends something, it updates multiple parts of the application.
Yep, that's a good point. And also dependency injection, we touched on that. It's just it's a design pattern where you don't have to like instantiate the class or object to put it inside your application. You just throw it in the constructor, so it makes it a little bit easier to add it into your app. Routing libraries, I use these occasionally. Well, I actually built into Angular, of course, is routing, and then there's these different types of routing elements that you can use. There's guards, there's router links. These really come in handy when you're trying to protect certain parts of your app. If you have some parts of your app that are authenticated and some that aren't authenticated, you can use these guards. Forms libraries is really a powerful feature inside Angular. So you have these reactive forms, but there's also template-driven forms. So it makes it really simple to create these really complicated or easy or complicated forms. I'll give an example. So when I first started learning Angular, and even just maybe last year, I was creating these forms, and I was just using the form tag, putting the inputs in, putting the different labels in, but I wasn't using any of the reactive or the template-driven forms that Angular has. So I would have to, every time something changed in one of those elements, and I wanted to do, let's say, validation on it to make sure someone didn't put in, a letters or some incorrect input into some of my inputs, I would have to look at the state every time it changed, go into my TypeScript file, do a bunch of validation, and then show an error on the screen. But as I learned more and more about Angular and their reactive forms and their template-driven forms, I realized there's so many built-in things that you can do where I can say, has someone clicked on it? Is it dirty? Is it valid? Can I create my own validations? So you can set up your whole Angular form, set up all your validation using reactive forms, then connect it up to your forms in your HTML. And then you have all these built-in things that will say, this form is valid, this form is not valid. And then you don't have to write all this extra boilerplate code to do it.
Yeah, reactive forms. Anyone who's had to do form validation or essentially stupid proof your application is what I like to call it, where it's like you put your phone number in your email because you're a moron. Reactive forms is going to stop that from happening and make it a lot easier. And template-driven, it's for smaller forms, not as big of a deal, and you can do some stuff with it. But when you're dealing with complex form functionality, where that's usually where you want to dive reactive. And there's a lot of boilerplate that goes with it, without a doubt. That's probably people's number one thing. Like, you have a 10 input form, you might have 200 lines of reactive forms to set it up, but it's very powerful and something I think people should get comfortable with.
You can even create your own accessors. So you can do a control accessor. You can essentially extend the reactive forms yourself and create your own validations and have it so that way data is really quickly shared between your main reactive form and it's just a lot of stuff you can do. And I'm still deep diving into everything it can do. It's pretty neat. There's ways you can transfer or send information between parent components and child components. There's inputs, which is an @input decorator, and then there's @output decorators that you can do event emitters that can go back to your parent components. You can pass any sort of values you want from parent components down to your child components. There's even more complicated things you can do with view children, which I'm not going to get into. There's several ways you can pass information back and forth from components. Do you use inputs and outputs?
Yeah, all the time. So like as you're building your component library, typically you're going to want to break it out into smaller pieces. And so you'll have maybe a parent that has some data that a child needs. Let's say we had a page and that was our parent, I guess, which would be a very large component. But then on that page, we had a list that we wanted to pass items from that list. So instead of calling that API call in two places, we call it once, and then we can pass that list portion to our child list component. So inputs and output, that's typically going to be something you're going to use very frequently when diving into components in Angular.
I had a friend that would, every time they would use add inputs, they would actually bind methods and then use the .bind, so you didn't have to use outputs at all. So there's a ways of getting around it. I didn't think it was very clear what I was doing. I didn't like it, but
yeah, that's just somebody who has a preference that is gonna hack their code together because they don't like something. That's what that sounds like.
So to wrap it up here, we have lifecycle hooks. So these are ng on init, ng on a destroy, ng on changes. You can also have a constructor inside your classes. So these are ways you can track when either the component is created or it's destroyed, as the name suggests. You can do kind of setup code inside your ng on init. I think that's pretty common. A lot of people, as soon as the component loads, they want to, talk to an API and grab some information to display on the screen and do XYZ. So that's how you do it, just all through these lifecycle hooks.
Yeah, and I would say lifecycle hooks are one of those items that have become sort of synonymous with single page applications, and understanding that in our web apps nowadays, there's certain things we want to do at certain times. And I think the concept of lifecycle hooks and they exist nowadays in just JavaScript, right? When the DOM loaded, or DOM content loaded, or, jQuery, when document ready. And so these are concepts that are familiar on a very document-based level. Now we're taking that concept and we're doing it on a component-based level.
And the last thing I want to talk about is just animations. They have a built-in, pretty complicated animation library. I haven't used it. Have you used it? Animation?
I have, and it is so ridiculous. So it does everything that you need to, and all it screams to me is that I'm a JavaScript developer and I don't want to learn CSS. That's all it screams. It's basically abstracting everything that's in CSS and giving it a function. It's very powerful. I have used it. Most of the time nowadays, all I do is I'll avoid it, and whatever transition I am doing, I'll just put a transition of 0.3 seconds, and then I'll animate what I want from state 1 to state 2.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I think you could probably do everything outside that and the animation library that Angular presents, but I guess if you get really good at it, it's powerful.
The main thing that I use it for is when a component is loaded and a component's destroyed. If there's something I want to showcase, that's really the only time I ever use it, and that makes it a little that's one of the more useful parts of it.
Yeah, honestly, I don't do tons of animations in my apps. Maybe just a little flourish here and there, maybe a little transformation. But most of the time, I think they're just too much. Unless you're doing some really splashy landing page, you want to get someone's attention, or you're doing this really cool animated map or something. I'm not a big fan of animations. I think it's really cool you can do it, but
I also don't even know where to start. I understand the idea of transitioning something from here to there, but I'm sure we've all had those stakeholders or those owners or whatever you want to call them. Can you make it pop? Can you make it sparkle? What does that mean? Tell me what you want me to make it do. What do you mean make it pop? I'll put pop right in here in text and but yeah, if you don't have a stakeholder or a UI UX guy saying, hey, make it do this, and you're probably not going to dive into it too much.
Yeah, exactly. So that's all I got today. I think we probably missed a few tiny parts, but I think that's, in a nutshell, the beginner's components and things that you should know for Angular.
Yeah, I mean, there's Angular is very vast. I'm learning stuff all the time. Like I learned that there's a metadata service today, and that there's a title service if you want to access the title. So Angular really does have quite a few pieces, and you can utilize what pieces you want about it, which makes it sort of very lightweight at the end of the day. So you don't have to use all of it. But I'm sure there's stuff we lost. We could talk about TypeScript in depth, and maybe in the next episode, because I'm a big fan of that. But Angular, these are the pieces to get you up and going, to get you understanding, and that's all I got.
Yeah, give it a shot, and also really good resources online. I know Udemy, Maximilian Schwartzmuller's React, or he has React course, and he also has a Angular course. I would check that out. When I first learned Angular and React, I both checked out his courses, and they were helpful.
Yeah, and some people like the Angular Tour of Duty hero app or whatever. So like Angular site does have a introduction app. I think it's dog shit. Like I did it when I was first learning Angular. I spent like a day on it, and I was like, what the hell is going on here? You're probably better off getting a Udemy course for $10 or watching a YouTube crash course on it and calling it a day.
Yeah, so Angular.io has all the official documentation. It has that Tour of Heroes app that Dylan just talked about, which I agree it's not perfect, but it tries to teach you everything about Angular in this one app, where it teaches like, oh, here we're adding a service. This is how you create your component. It's a little heavy-handed, but and I also notice I will do a little criticism. I think the docs aren't as good as other frameworks. There's certain times where I'll pull up something I want to learn in Angular, and I'll pull up the docs, and all it is just a reference to the code. And you have to literally like read the code on the screen to figure out what it's supposed to do, and there's no examples. So you're almost better off at times just Googling it and just seeing if someone wrote an article about it.
Yeah. And I think someone asked me, like, how would you describe the dynamic of our podcast? And I think next time I'll say, well, I'll say something's dog shit, and Eric will say that there's some room for improvement. Because I will say those docs, I was on there today. It's literally like, here's what the interface is like. Well, can I get an example of how you might use this? Nope. Awful. Absolutely awful. That's definitely some room for improvement, as Eric might say.
Yeah. And and one of the things, it's just huge. There's so many things in Angular that, like I said, I didn't even know about the meta service either. All right, man.
All right. That's
Peace.
it. Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you want to find more about what I'm up to, go to dylanisrael.com.
And if you want to know what I'm up to, you can check out my website at eric.video. If you haven't already, please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And if you do, you might even be featured on our next episode. Don't forget to check out the website at selftaughtornot.com. From there, you can sign up for a mailing list where we give away free courses and a bunch of cool stuff. And we'll also let you know when the next episode comes out. And finally, if you didn't know, we have a Facebook group. It's called Code, Tech, and Caffeine. We have over 10,000 members. And you can find the link at selftaughtornot.com. So come join us. We have tons of developers willing to help you guys, mentor you guys. Check it out. Just make sure you go to selftaughtornot.com and check out the Code, Tech, and Caffeine link. Thanks, and take care.